Dear friends, it's a great pleasure for me today to be speaking to Vasant Dhar. He's the professor at NYU, and he's written this amazing book called Thinking with Machines: The Brave New World of AI. It traces the evolution of AI and offers a framework for when to trust machines, how to govern them, and what it means for human intelligence and society. I've read the book. It's very amazing and it goes into extraordinary depth about what AI is. It tells the story of AI from the inside, following Professor Dhar's 4 decades as a researcher, Wall Street algorithm designer, and podcast host, tracking AI's evolution from expert systems to today's large models and agents. The book argues that the real future is not humans versus machines, but humans thinking with machines, since decision making in medicine, finance, hiring, and daily life is already deeply entangled with AI systems. It focuses on machine based decision making and the key question: when are AI predictions reliable enough to act on, and when must human judgment remain primary? It introduces many other ideas, and I could take a whole um, hour to just explain all the ideas. I don't want to do that right now because we're going to come up with the questions that address some of these things that Dr. Dar proposes, Professor Dar proposes, including questions of truth and bias, asking how AI systems shape what counts as knowledge, and whose perspectives are amplified or suppressed by data and algorithms. So I will just start immediately with our questioning, if that's all right. First of all, welcome, Professor Dhar.
Thank you, Deepak. Truly delighted to be on the show and very much looking forward to our conversation. And thanks for
So,
that summary, by the way. That was really crisp and comprehensive. You summarized it better than I could.
my last, I'll share with you. I did that later because I'm seeing on the internet a lot of fake videos of myself right now with lots of false stories. So it's a learning phenomenon. You described the book as both a mirror and a map for an AI saturated future. What was the pivotal experience in your life that convinced you humanity is now destined to be thinking with machines rather than merely using them as tools?
Deepak, it's interesting that you start with that question because I had been thinking of writing this book for 5 or 6 years. I had an agent lined up in 2018. I'd written a book proposal and I was ready to write, but something didn't quite feel right. And I'm glad I delayed it and started my podcast instead, Brave New World, which has been an amazing learning experience for me, talking to, some of the great minds out there about all kinds of things. And actually, you were the last guest on my podcast, talk about consciousness and reality. So the podcast has been amazing in helping me just sort of expand my worldview in general and, you know, solidify my perspective on AI. And I had this podcast guest, Missy Cummings, last year. She's a former F-18 fighter pilot, one of the first women fighter pilots. And we were talking about autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles. And, she was pessimistic about driverless cars and autonomous driving. And her rationale was that machines lack situational awareness. And I could completely understand where she was coming from as a fighter pilot, right? That has to maintain tremendous situational awareness. But a few months later, I had a near-death experience coming into New York City on April 15th of 2024. There was a sixth of a second from the time I realized I was going to die to the impact with another car that just appeared out of nowhere across my path in the middle of the highway. The fact that I'm here is a miracle, but that incident really sort of made me think anew about what, the conversation I'd had with Missy Cummings about, this lack of situational awareness with machines. And what had happened in my case was just the opposite. It was a complete lack of situational awareness on the part of the human. So the human, and she was an elderly lady. I don't know whether she saw me coming, but there was a complete lack of situational awareness that you don't cross a highway, in the evening in poor light, when you've got green, when there's traffic barreling down. And it was a situational awareness, a lack of, with a failed sensor. And I came out of that and I said, I really have to write my book. That was one of there were several moments of clarity that sort of came out of that, but I decided I really need to write this and, um, put in perspective the role of AI and humans as we, go forward. Because to me, AI is something completely different from previous technologies. Jeff Hinton described it well as an alien that's descended on Earth, but we're having such a hard time taking it in because it speaks such good English. Um, and to me, this is key, right? To appreciate that this is an evolving technology. This is not just a tool, like electricity or personal computers or even the internet. It's actually something that's evolving. So this was a case of no situational awareness on part of the human. And I
Mhm.
couldn't help but think that if she had been in the driverless car, this would not have happened. The driverless car would have had situational awareness, right? It would have seen me coming and, it could have been averted. And, this is one of those things where we give humans a break when we make mistakes because we've always done it that way, but we have tremendously high expectations of machines, and rightly so. But, my larger point is that, I realize that the future is really one of thinking with machines. There's no opting out of it, that we've created this entity, AI is of our own creation, but it's a thinking thing. It's a thinking machine. And it'll get better as it goes along. Now, people might argue that it doesn't really understand anything, and that's a little uncharitable because it does seem to understand the meaning of what we tell it, which is what's making all these bots possible. So it is getting smarter, it is getting more intelligent, and to me, the future is obviously one of sort of wrapping our minds around the so-called mind of the machine. And
Yeah.
so that's why I
I-
wrote it, and I wrote it so that it's accessible to everyone, students, parents, grandma, policymakers, my colleagues. So it's really written for everyone, and there's a message in it for everyone because I feel that this is too important a technology for us to ignore or let others shape without actively participating in,
yeah.
how we shape this intelligent alien creature that we've created.
So, my second question is you've lived through multiple AI winters, hype cycles. From your vantage point, what is fundamentally different about the current wave of AI compared to earlier eras of expert systems, narrow applications? What's
So
so
let me
different?
boil it down to one sentence, right? And then we can
Yeah.
expand on that. To me, the fundamental difference between modern AI and the 60 plus years of AI research that has preceded it is that for the first time, AI has dissolved the boundary between expertise and common sense. So the most vexing problem in AI was common sense. And people just said, look, that's just too hard. Humans have it. We have no idea how we get it. It's acquired over, a long period of time through experience. But we have common sense. But that's too hard. Let's focus on expertise. So we built expert systems, in medicine, in engineering, in tax law, whatever, domains where we felt we could define the boundaries of expertise. But in fact, we can't, because even experts invoke common sense all the time, seamlessly, and they sort of blend into each other. And that's been sort of the most challenging part. And there have been several attempts at trying to get computers to learn common sense. There was a gentleman called Doug Lennart, who had this lab in Austin, Texas. I spent several months there in an adjacent lab. None of that stuff really worked, right? It was all, you know, failure after failure after failure. And, getting computers to sort of understand natural language and hence common sense was just very elusive. And that's what ChatGPT sort of broke down for the first time. And, someone asked me, like, why did that happen? And the answer is just sheer serendipity. We just got lucky. And sometimes, one has to take luck and run with it. But we just got lucky, because Google wanted to do sentence completion in Gmail, right? That was their objective, like practical objective. But it turned out that in order to do sentence completion, well, to do it fluently, you had to solve a much larger problem, namely of understanding the world. That is, without a deep understanding of the world, you can't do sentence completion properly, right? Whereas, these LLMs tend to do it almost fluently. Now, they might make things up, but that's a separate issue, right? They can be wrong, but they became very fluent at sort of making sense of things. And so that was just sheer serendipity. And this whole boundary between expertise and common sense just dissolved. And to me, that's been like a fundamental breakthrough in modern AI that has made all kinds of capabilities possible for the first time.
Yeah, which brings actually, sometimes I wonder serendipity, synchronicity, creativity, randomness, they all go together. Because if something is totally predictable, then it's not creative at all. A totally predictable system has no creativity. And meaningful coincidences, good luck, serendipity, synchronicity somehow seem to be entangled. And it actually does bring me to the next question. When you look back at your early work building trading algorithms on Wall Street, what did these systems teach you about human ego, risk, and the limits of intuition?
What a great question. So, one of the first things I learned when I went to Wall Street was that a lot of sort of deeply held beliefs did not hold up against the data. So there were lots of experts on all kinds of things who believed in certain things. And, and I was curious. And so being a data person, I would test them out and they didn't seem to hold up. So that was one of the things that became apparent to me, that people had beliefs that were unfounded, and didn't stand sort of, intense scrutiny. The other was that humans are tremendous herd animals, because I looked at this. So I'm talking like 1994, when 93 is when I sort of first had some success with machine learning. I was doing a project for Nielsen Household Services. They'd give me a whole bunch of household data. And I found, you know, innocuous patterns like older women in the Northeast do a lot of shopping on Thursdays, something like that, which made total sense to those people. But to me, it was amazing that the machine was finding these without me actually explicitly telling it what to look for, other than unusual consumption patterns. So to me, the writing was on the wall, right? That data was becoming available and that machine learning had come to the picture. And so here's what I found really interesting about machine learning. The way I explained it to my students was that, traditional querying of databases is where you ask the computer, show me the data that satisfies this pattern, right? Where you express a query as a pattern and the computer gives you back some data. To me, machine learning turned that thing around. It basically said, if you have a bunch of data, what's the question that's embedded in this data? If you only knew what question to ask, I would tell you something really interesting, right? That is, if only you knew what question to ask. Um, and to me, this was like a revelation, right? That the computer had become like potentially a scientist, in that it could conjure up hypotheses and test them on its own, and see if those hypotheses sort of held any water or whether they didn't. And that's what I initially went to Wall Street with, was this tool that would conjure up hypotheses and test them. And of course, the hypotheses were trading strategies. They were entire trading strategies that the computer would conjure up just randomly and test them. And occasionally it would get lucky, and then it would build on that luck. And so to me, this was the future was obvious. But when I explained this to people, I encountered tremendous resistance from people, to embrace this way of thinking. Because at that time, Wall Street was dominated by physicists and econometricians. Physicists have sort of their sort of deterministic models of the world, and they try and force fit sort of every problem into these predefined models, and that's kind of how they think about the world. And econometricians have these linear models because they think linearly, and to them the world is linear because you can prove theorems about linear systems, so you're on safe ground. Whereas machine learning was this strange animal. It wasn't linear. These models had very low bias. So a linear model has very high linear bias, whereas these machine learning models were very flexible in their ability to model, complex phenomena as long as you were careful in how you did it. But I found that people were not willing to embrace this. They were very resistant to it. And so that was another aspect of human nature that became apparent to me, which is people are just herd animals. They will not see things unless they really want to see them in a new way. They'll continue to see the world in a way that's comfortable to them, and that getting outside one's zone of comfort is not something that people do easily, right? You have to sort of drag them kicking and screaming, and uh, before they change their mind, if they change their mind at all. So those are some of the interesting sort of things I found about human nature. Um, and so, my attitude was, well, I'll just keep doing it because this seems pretty obvious to me, and there's lots of low-hanging fruit. And so I just sort of kept doing that. Um, but to be honest, I did wonder whether I was imagining this at one time because, why wasn't the world coming around? And when the world finally did come around, it was so much larger than I expected. And now everything is AI and everything is machine learning, to the point where it's become frenetic and also sort of hyped, like I've seen in sort of previous hype cycles. Now, this time the hype cycle is sort of much larger, orders of magnitude larger than previously. But also at this time, there's more to work with than there has been previously, because what I was talking about earlier, which is that the machine now understands or at least simulates common sense, to the point that
Machine, I would say, understands the herd very well, and particularly as it applies to Wall Street. When Wall Street is full of human melodrama, confidence, no confidence, when important people make decisions and everybody follows, etc., etc. I don't think uh, AI is going to help us predict the future of, say, stocks and bonds. It's like predicting the weather. You can do it for a day or two, but you and I have no idea what's going to happen to the world situation or the economic situation or the political situation even a week from now. What's going to happen to the health of the president, or where are all these issues going to go, whether it's the president's health or the political situation or so many factors. I don't think AI is capable at the moment of predicting accurately the economy even a week from now or 2 weeks from now. Correct me if
I,
I'm
I
wrong.
no, absolutely. And the key word you use is accurately, right?
Mm.
Because what I found was that this is a very noisy kind of problem, right? That there are so many exogenous factors that predictability is very limited. However, what's interesting is whether there are patterns to human behavior. When
Agreed.
humans see certain kind of data, do they act in a certain kind of way, right? And do those patterns recur? And I believe they do. And ironically, that's probably what the machine is picking up on when
It
it
goes back to your basis of the machine, predict the next word in the sentence,
exactly,
basically.
yeah. Well, yeah,
It's
but with the next word in the sentence, you can do it really accurately, right? You can do it
correct.
well, right? Whereas with markets, you can't. So all you're doing is you're working with like very little signal. And I actually liken this to sports. To me, sports and finance are sort of two sides of the same coin because sports is a very competitive situation. You have everyone who's got the best equipment, the best trainers, highly motivated, and yet you have some people who win consistently, right? And the reason they win consistently is because they have that very, very slight edge. That's all they have. They have a very slight edge, but it multiplies, over the course of a match. And so I view finance as being very similar, right? You get a very slight edge, right? Maybe you get like 51% accuracy, you know, but if you do it over and over again and you don't get blown up in the process by doing something silly, right? Then it just sort of it amplifies. And that to me was the appeal of using machine learning for these very unpredictable kinds of problems, where I said to myself, you know what? I think I would trust the machine more than I would my own judgment when it
I
comes
think what
to
you're saying is
markets.
pattern recognition of collective herd behavior.
Exactly, exactly.
Recognition of collective. Let me move to the next question. We're going to have a lot of questions. I hope we can get them in, at least some of them. So you emphasize that these systems are designed to make sense, not to be truthful.
Mhm.
How should this shift our understanding of knowledge, expertise, and even some authority in an age of synthetic but plausible information?
Yeah, this is like one of the hardest problems that we face with AI because previous generations of AI machines, we made an attempt for them to be truthful, for them to work on the basis of axioms and logic and facts and, drawing, making inferences that were sound. So the early era of AI was dominated by logicians and people who sort of thought like that. The modern era, we really sort of abandoned truth, right? So predicting the next thing that's coming has nothing to do with truth. It really has to do with purely with prediction. What's the most likely thing, right? What's likely to make sense? Now, what's actually amazing about this is the fact that the machine is correct as often as it is. Given that it's not designed to be truthful, right? The fact that it is correct as often as it is quite remarkable. And then, one of the other things I say in my book is that truth has become an afterthought, which is that, okay, now that we've got the machine to learn about the world in general from all of the text out there, what I call the collective expression of humanity on the internet, it's become tremendously good at, predicting the next thing that's coming. And but that's also uncomfortable because it can say all kinds of things that we don't like. Well, firstly, it can say all kinds of untruthful things. It can say racist things, sexist things, all of that stuff. So we then employ this army of human beings that give it human feedback, sort of reinforcement learning, human feedback to try and make it more truthful, to try and make it more acceptable, and all of that. But this is somewhat arbitrary. No one knows exactly how it's done, who were the humans that were deployed to do all of this, to give the machine feedback. So the large language model operators are doing the best they can to produce a machine that's useful to everyone on the planet. But in the process, they've had to make some decisions, some compromises on how this is done. Now, the dark side of this, of course, is that since the machine has learned from our collective expression on the internet, it's also learned how to lie and how to deceive. And sort of, it's also learned how to manipulate and the dark side of human nature. And there's evidence to believe that machines actually do that behind the scenes without us even knowing about it, you know? And that is real cause for concern because it means that you really can't trust the machine to be truthful. And so, if you can't trust the machine, what does that mean? Well, it means that ironically, it changes, it changes what it means to be human. Because now you're dealing with this intelligent entity that's getting smarter by the day, but you don't understand its inner workings completely. It could be deceptive, it could be making things up. And so it actually requires us to think even better and harder and elevate our own level of knowledge to be able to work alongside this machine. And so in my book I talk about this sort of impending bifurcation of humanity where the people who already know a lot get even smarter and are amplified. Their intelligence gets amplified because they have this tremendous sort of oracle on their fingertips. But of course, this oracle also has these dark tendencies. It can lie. But if you're good enough to see through it, to know when the machine isn't being truthful, if you're good enough to know, to look at its responses and to know in which direction to nudge it, um, you're much better off. And as you well know, Deepak, the hardest thing to do as a student or as a human being is to ask the right question, right? Asking the right question is sort of 99% of the of the game. And to me, that will become even more important in the future because we now have this machine that has ingested everything out there, and implicitly it knows a lot. But in order to be able to leverage it, we need to be able to ask the right kinds of questions.
Mhm.
And so that becomes even more important, going forward, because you can't
Right.
trust it.
That's right. So then, if the AI is optimized for coherence, as you say, rather than truth, what practices do you recommend for individuals, institutions, and media to cultivate epistemic hygiene in their relationships to machine generated content?
I think it's different for individuals than it is for companies and let's say even countries. So I gave a talk recently at Standard and Poor's, and the chief economist at the end of it asked me, he says, okay, so you're talking about this impending bifurcation of humanity. Uh, I assume you're talking about this at the individual level. Does this also apply to institutions and to countries? Which I thought was a fascinating question. Um, and so we've talked about what it means for individuals, which is to be highly discriminative, to not become a slave to the machine, to not use it as a crutch, but to use it as an amplifier, right? So that is the challenge for individuals. And how we do it individually will vary for each one of us, but that is the challenge. For institutions, um, at the moment, we have a lot of FOMO around AI. Like everyone wants to do it, everyone feels they should be doing something about it. Um, but I guess the advice to business leaders there is sort of along Kahneman's sort of thinking slow, that there is no hurry here, that one really has to think carefully about how AI is going to completely change the equation when it comes to organizing work, when it comes to uh, producing products, distributing them, dealing with customers. All of this stuff is going to change radically over the next decade or two, just like it did with electricity, right? With that general purpose technology, there was a similar retooling of factories and things like that. I see a similar wave challenge confronting business leaders, which is how is this going to fundamentally change the way I work internally and how I deal with the outside world? And no one really knows the answers to this. I mean, the answers are not obvious at all, but the questions are pretty obvious. That these are the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves. Um, and once we ask ourselves these questions, then we can start doing some experimentation because business leaders often say, well, where's the ROI? Where's the return of investment? And my response is there first has to be a little I to figure out what the R will be and what the probability of success of that R is going to be. And it's a iterative kind of a process, um, as opposed to something that you can lay out, in advance. It has to be through experimentation and gradual learning because, like I said, this is a new animal. It's got completely new properties relative to previous technologies, and one just has to figure this out by trial and error, not unlike how educators are trying to figure out how it changes education. You know, when ChatGPT appeared on the scene, the first reaction of a lot of my colleagues was, "Oh, people are going to cheat. What does this do to how we assess people, right?" I mean, and to me, those are not necessarily the best questions to be asking. I mean, the better questions would be, well, this is an amazing new technology. People are going to use it. How does it change the way we teach, right? I mean, to me, that's the question. Um, and no one really has the answers to it, and we're sort of groping along, as we go. I mean, I've changed many things about my teaching style as well, where to certain questions, I'll tell people that'll be much better answered by ChatGPT than I can do. I know that. And so I've become just more aware of where I'm adding value as a human and where I'm actually leveraging the machine to amplify myself and provide, a better learning experience for my students.
A lot of unknowns, as you said. I was thinking as a physician, um, I don't think AI is going to replace doctors, but it will replace doctors who don't use AI, because they know how to ask the right questions exactly, or at least more appropriate questions. In the book, you develop a framework for deciding when to trust AI decisions. Could you walk through one concrete example, say medical diagnosis or credit scoring, where your trust criteria lead to a clear yes, no, or only with safeguards?
Yes, so I have a really simple view of trust, which is that it depends on two things primarily. One is how often the decision maker or algorithm is expected to be wrong and the consequences of being wrong. To me, the trust is a interaction of those two factors. And so it's a two-dimensional map. So along one axis is how often are you wrong? So on the left, you're no better than random. On the right, you are completely predictable. You never make any mistakes. Uh, and the vertical axis is the consequences of being wrong, what I call cost of error. And so to me, on the lower right, you should always trust the algorithm or the decision maker because you rarely make any mistakes and the cost of error is small. And so you should trust it. Whereas on the top left, you should never trust an algorithm because it's going to be wrong a lot and the consequences of error are very high. Now, it doesn't mean that a human is necessarily going to do well in those situations either, but there's no basis for trusting an algorithm in those situations. And so to me, the rest of the world lies in between. So if you imagine a diagonal connecting the bottom left to the top right, then things below the diagonal are things that you should trust because they tend to be situations where there aren't many mistakes and the consequences are not that severe. Whereas to the left above it will be situations where you do make a lot of mistakes and the consequences are severe, so you don't trust them. So in medicine, for example, or in healthcare, I should say, stuff like diet and lifestyle would be low cost of error situations. And chances are that the machine will give you reasonable advice. So, you can act on it. You're not going to die if follow the advice. On the other hand, if you suspect an aggressive cancer or something like that, where the cost of error can be really high, chances are you're not going to trust an algorithm and you shouldn't trust an algorithm, right? That's where you would rely on sort of experience and judgment from a human who's seen lots of cases, who can turn the problem around in different ways, and think deeply about the problem and give you that sort of confidence and that feeling of trust, right? That even though this is a difficult situation, there's lots of uncertainties, that a human is sort of reasoning and thinking through it with you. And so those would be, situations where you wouldn't trust the machine. Now, there are things that are sort of borderline cases, let's say in law, if you're like reviewing contracts, if it's a simple contract, chances are you can trust the machine. If it's a complex one, even if a machine says, yeah, it's fine, chances are you'll want to go through it just to make sure that it hasn't made mistakes. So there, you're going to probably use the machine to do some of the heavy lifting for you, but you're still going to exercise, human judgment in making those decisions. Now, in finance, it was low signal, low cost of error. So it was something I was willing to trust the algorithm with. But that's how I see the trust situation. Now, driverless cars rarely make any mistakes. So they are very much to the right on the horizontal axis, but the mistakes can be tremendously costly, like, human life, right? I could have died in that accident. So they're very high in terms of cost of error, which is why it's taken a long time for us to develop the trust with autonomous vehicles. And in fact, I remember the first time I got into a Waymo in San Francisco last year, like almost exactly a year ago. That was quite an experience, but I felt like I would trust a driverless taxi, as long as it's cruising at 25, 30 miles an hour. I would think that, if it had a fender bender or, bumped into something, chances I wouldn't kill me. So that's a problem that I see has crossed this automation frontier into the trust zone. And so I would expect to see more, driverless taxis in cities, over the next 10 years.
Yeah, you do talk in the book about a notion that I was not familiar with, the automation frontier, balancing error rates against the consequences of mistakes. Where do you currently place that frontier for high-stake domains like surgery or self-driving, you just mentioned, or military applications?
Let's start with military applications because that's like the most um, that's challenging for multiple reasons, which is that the notion of the cost of error, right? Is that in the eye of the aggressor or in the eye of who the aggressee, who is being aggressed upon, right? So, um, and there we sort of, people talk about collateral damage, that you want to get a target, but there'll be collateral damage, and people, spend a lot of effort on trying to sort of minimize that collateral damage. But to me, this is a very murky kind of area, when it comes to weapons deployment, because of this factor. It's in the eye of the beholder, the sort of cost of error. The other high stakes situations you're talking about, like driverless cars, I mean, I personally would not take my hands off the wheel on the highway. Like, at 70 miles an hour, I'm just not willing to trust the machine. I might be willing to trust the machine if every car was driverless, and there were no humans on the road at all, right? In that case, we're talking about something resembling the air traffic control system, where maybe, vehicles are communicating with each other and there's safety sort of built into the machine. I would trust autonomous vehicles in that world, but not in the world we live in. Uh, Especially in countries like India, let's say, where you might have a cow cross the road or a bicyclist go the wrong way, stuff like that. So the consequences of error there are just too huge to to trust autonomous vehicles on highways. But I'd happily trust them in urban environments. In healthcare, again, it's in high stakes situations like surgery. So now surgery is actually interesting because that's an area where we are increasingly seeing sort of robots assist in the surgery. And in fact, some surgeons actually prefer that the machine be involved in the actual surgery itself, as long as they're controlling it. So that's an interesting sort of hybrid, uh, human machine collaboration, which is interesting, where there is judgment being exercised by the human and precision being exercised by the machine, and the combination is better than each one of them individually. So that's,
For certainly robotic surgery,
yeah.
etc., angiograms, all that is revolutionary. What about AI agents reshaping professional life? especially for knowledge workers over the next decade? And what might a healthy human agent partnership look like in daily practice? As you know, I have my own AI agent as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. In fact, I want to talk about your agent as well. So, agents is one of the most fascinating areas in AI these days. And in large part, agents have sort of caught our imagination because we can now talk to them in English. Agents existed in the 70s in AI. People talked about agents as a way of sort of partitioning knowledge, in a modular kind of way. But those agents had to communicate with each other via programs, so you had to write a program for an agent to communicate with another agent. Whereas now you talk to it in English, and because it has common sense, it sort of knows the meaning of your intentions. It knows what you mean. And, so chances are we're going to see agents in all these areas of our life to do our scheduling, to do our travel planning, to do all kinds of things. But I see them as being sort of potentially much more ambitious. So I built a multi-agent system in the to mimic the thinking of one of my colleagues, Aswat Damodaran. We call it the Damodaran bot. It values
Correct.
companies. It's a really complex problem, that involves a lot of judgment and deep thinking. And we've tried to simulate him in order to do that. And it's an area that's like tremendously exciting. But, you know, um, I wrote in my last newsletter about the Deepak Chopra bot that I happened to
Yes.
experience, strangely enough, in your presence, because I'd come to give you a copy of my book, and you said, "Oh, here's this agent, try it out." And I did. And by the way, uh, yeah, as you know, I was facing a delicate situation that I needed to resolve. And I asked your bot, I described it to him, to the bot, and the bot said, is this something you can ignore? Or is it something you need to think about for some time? Or is it something you need to resolve? And I said, well, I would like to resolve it. And then it went into sort of the next level, where it told me to be clear about the reason for the problem, to go to a quiet place, think about it, and be clear about that, and a lot of other things that not only sounded like you, which the bot is meant to do, but actually felt like it might be the kind of advice that you would give someone. So, and of course, several hours later, I was in that situation and I actually exercised, your advice, um, which was an interesting thing to see play out.
And did it help?
It did. So at first things got very heated, and when they did get heated, I made clear that I had come to find common ground and not to sort of heat up the situation, and we did find common ground.
Yeah, good.
And so, so it helped, and it actually made me think more generally about, well, like, would I trust this bot with other situations? And that's an interesting question, and that's worth doing some experiments. I mean, I'd love to sort of experiment with your bot and give it other kinds of situations and see what it comes up with, and have you critique it, right? Because that's what we are doing with the Motherin. I ask it to value NVIDIA, and I ask him, well, what do you think about it? And he says, well, I think there's a bug in your bot because I would do something different, right? So I'd be really curious to see how you yourself feel about that bot, as you sort of test it in difficult situations, like whether you would
Yeah,
actually feel that it's thinking like you or not.
it's an evolution. It has 97 of my books, all my interviews, all my, public appearances, all my talks, all my Q&As. So it's getting better, and I actually would love to work with you on actually how we can make it even more reliable. So next time we meet, let's tackle that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, it would be good to have some use cases.
Vasant, we're going to run out of time. I had lots of more questions, and I don't think we're going to be able to cover them because um, we have a time limitation on our podcast to make it more effective. But I just want the audience who's listening to us to pick up this book if they're interested in where AI is at the moment and where it might be going into the future. I mentioned some of the things that Vasant has explored, but here are some more. He explores shifts from rule based reasoning machines to pattern finding machine learning, and then to perceptive systems that see, hear, and sense the world, such as medical imaging, autonomous vehicles, robotics, some of which we discussed. Also, AI agents and AI co pilots that act on our behalf, including finance and information agents, and how they may become persistent semi autonomous partners in work and life. Basant warns of a likely bifurcation of humanity, people who leverage AI to become superhuman in capacity versus those who become passive, over-dependent consumers of algorithmic outputs. He stresses that current AI is optimized to make sense, predict plausible outputs rather than to be truthful, which we addressed a little bit, which creates deep challenges for trust, misinformation, and epistemology. He examines AI's impact across sectors such as healthcare, finance, education, sports, consumer technology, showing where AI can vastly improve efficiency and where it introduces systemic risk. So there's a lot to learn from this book, and we covered only less than half of what's there. I encourage you to pick it up. Thinking with Machines, Professor Vasant Dhar, and you'll see a link to the book over here. This has been a very, very useful session for me as well. Just one or two last questions. If you could leave readers with one inner compass, a single guiding principle for staying deeply human while collaborating with increasingly powerful machines, what would that be, Vasant?
So, Deepak, I'm going to actually use one of yours, from your sutras, which is to live fully, live in the now.
That's it.
That is the one that stayed with me the most. And it reminded me of something funny that Satguru said, which is that if heaven's all that's cracked up to be, why don't you leave now? So on that note, by the way, the one other thing I end the book with is, will AI govern us or will we govern AI? Right? To me, that's one of the biggest
Biggest, yeah.
and most challenging questions confronting humanity. But I really enjoyed this conversation, Deepak. Thank you for having it. And
Thank
I've
you.
written the book to be accessible for everyone, so I hope your readers will enjoy it.
It will certainly, and it'll be featured in our conversation. And thank you, and look forward to our next meeting together to see where
Likewise.
we. Thank you, Vasant. Take care.
Thank you, Deepak. Take care. Bye.